People forget I ever raced stock cars at all. They remember Indy. They remember the Speedway. They forget I won Daytona too, and that I sat in enough NASCAR garages to know exactly who belonged in that sport and who didn't. That question keeps coming up more than you'd think. AJ, you raced Indy cars, sports cars, stock cars, you raced everything with an engine bolted to it, so who were the 5 greatest NASCAR drivers you ever actually saw? Now, most people expect me to just rattle off names because they won a lot of races. That's not how I judge a man behind the wheel, and it never has been, not in 60 years of doing this. I judge him by what he did when the car wasn't working right, when the track turned mean underneath him, when the other fella next to him wasn't backing down no matter how hard he leaned on him. I raced stock cars against some of the toughest sons of guns this sport ever produced. Back when a fist fight after the checkered flag wasn't rare, it was practically part of the show, expected almost, like a second race that started the moment the first one ended. Some of these men I respected before I ever met them, just from watching what they did on Sunday afternoons, from the stands or from a garage across the way. Some I didn't respect until I got run into a wall by them personally and understood exactly what I was dealing with out there on that particular day. 5 names stick with me above all the rest. Even now, all these decades later, long after most of those cars and those tracks have changed beyond recognition, and I still think about every single one of them whenever somebody brings this sport up. Richard Petty has to be first, and there's no getting around that fact. None at all. I raced against Richard plenty of times over the years, in different cars, on different tracks, in different decades of my career, and what always struck me wasn't just how often he won, though Lord knows he won more races than anybody had any right to in one lifetime. It was how he handled himself doing it, weekend after weekend, without ever seeming to change. Richard never needed to run you off the track to beat you. He beat you with patience, with a car that held together when everybody else's fell apart around lap 200, when the rest of the field was already limping home on worn-out equipment. I remember one particular afternoon watching him nurse a loose race car home for the final 50 laps without ever once looking rattled about it. Not even a little bit. Most drivers would have been sawing at that wheel like a man fighting off a swarm of bees, fighting the car every single lap just to keep it pointed straight. Richard just adjusted, quietly, calmly, and kept the thing pointed where it needed to go. That's a kind of discipline you can't teach a young driver, no matter how good your notes are or how many laps he's turned in practice. He carried himself the same way he drove, calm on the outside, working hard the whole time underneath it where nobody could see. Beating Richard meant outlasting him, because he rarely broke a car, and he rarely broke himself either. Race after race, year after year, decade after decade in that same deliberate, patient style. I raced against a lot of men who were faster than Richard over one single lap. Sure, plenty of them. I never once raced against anybody who beat him over 500 miles more often than he beat them. Not across a whole career. Then there was Cale Yarborough, and Cale scared me a little. I'll admit that plainly. Right here, all these years later. Not because he was dirty, though he'd rough you up if you gave him half a reason to. It was because Cale drove like the car owed him something personal, like it had wronged him somehow, and he was out there collecting on the debt every single lap. He'd take a corner other men were still thinking about, still weighing the risk of, and he'd already be through it clean, foot flat to the floor, like the danger simply didn't register with him the way it did with the rest of us mortals. I raced against him at Daytona once and watched him run a lap that shouldn't have held together at all. Tires screaming under him, the whole car looking like it wanted to come apart, and he just kept his foot in it anyway, daring the thing to fail. What made Cale so dangerous wasn't raw talent alone. Plenty of men out there had that kind of talent. It was that he genuinely didn't seem to fear the wall the way a sane man ought to fear it. He'd trade paint with you at 190 miles an hour without blinking and shrug about it in the garage 20 minutes later like nothing at all had happened between us. Racing Cale taught me something I carried with me the rest of my career, that sometimes the man who wins isn't the smoothest driver out on that track. It's the one who simply refuses to lift, ever, under any circumstance, no matter what his crew chief is screaming in his ear over the radio. I've known a lot of brave men in this sport over the years, men who'd tell you themselves they weren't afraid of anything on four wheels. Cale was different from most of them. He wasn't performing bravery for the cameras or the crowd in the stands. It was just how the man was built underneath it all, plain and simple, and you either respected that about him or you got out of his way when he came calling, because he wasn't slowing down for either option. Then came David Pearson. And if you ask most old NASCAR men who the smartest driver they ever raced was, Pearson's name comes up quick, faster than almost anybody else you could mention. They called him the Silver Fox for good reason, and that nickname fit him better than any nickname I ever heard handed to a race car driver in this sport. David never seemed to be trying hard, not on the surface anyway, and that was the whole trick of it, the part most people watching from the stands never quite understood about him, no matter how many times they saw him do it race after race. He'd sit back, save his tires, save his engine, let the fools up front burn themselves out fighting each other lap after lap over a position that didn't matter yet, and then here he'd come in the last 20 laps like he'd been saving something the rest of us didn't even know we needed to be saving ourselves. I got beat by him more than once that way, chasing him down too late to matter, watching him roll past me right when I thought I finally had the race won. He read a racetrack the way a man reads a road he's driven his whole life, knowing exactly where the bumps were before he ever hit them, knowing exactly which groove would still have grip left in it when everybody else's was gone. Racing David meant you couldn't relax for one single lap of that race, not one, because the second you did, he was already gone, quiet as a cat slipping through a fence, and you wouldn't see him again until the white flag was waving, and it was already too late to catch him, no matter how hard you pushed that last lap trying. I've thought about that man a lot over the years, more than people might expect given how quiet he was about his own success. He never bragged. He never needed to. The results did all the talking for him, race after race, year after year, while other men wore themselves out trying to prove something David had already proven a long time before, quietly, without ever raising his voice about it in the garage or anywhere else. There's a lesson in that for any young driver coming up today, though I doubt many of them would sit still long enough to hear it properly. Bobby Allison is the next man I have to mention, and Bobby was as tough as anybody I ever strapped into a stock car against, anywhere, on any track, in any condition, in any kind of weather that racetrack decided to throw at us that particular weekend. What made Bobby dangerous was that he never seemed to run out of fight, not in one single race, not across an entire career that spanned decades of this sport, across countless tracks and countless different race cars along the way. I watched him get wrecked hard, climb out of that car mad as hell, dust himself off, and come back the following week even harder to beat than he'd been before the wreck ever happened. He drove like a man settling an argument every single lap of every single race, and half the time he probably was settling one, given how that garage operated back then, given how personal some of those rivalries got once the cars were parked and the helmets came off. Bobby's strength was never subtlety, and he'd probably be the first man to admit that himself if you asked him plainly, sitting across a table from him today. It was sheer will married to real skill underneath it, and when those two things lined up in the same afternoon, on the same racetrack, there wasn't a driver in that field who wanted to be racing him for a position that actually mattered come Sunday afternoon. Racing against Bobby taught me that stubbornness, real stubbornness, the kind that doesn't bend no matter how hard you lean on it, can be its own kind of weapon on a racetrack, every bit as sharp as raw speed or a perfectly tuned engine. I remember drivers talking about him in the garage with a certain respect that wasn't given easily to just anybody in that era, because everybody there understood exactly what it cost a man to keep coming back the way Bobby did, week after week, year after year, no matter how many times the sport knocked him down along the way. And it knocked him down plenty over the years, more than most fans watching from the grandstands ever fully realized at the time, and still he kept showing up on Sunday with that same look in his eye, ready to go again. Both of these men taught me something different about what it takes to survive a long career in this business. And I don't just mean surviving a single race or a single season. David taught me patience wrapped around genuine cunning, the kind of restraint that looks like weakness right up until the moment it isn't anymore. Bobby taught me that raw determination, sustained over years instead of just one afternoon, can carry a man further than talent alone ever could on its own. I raced against plenty of men who had one of those two qualities. Precious few of them ever had both sitting inside the same driver at the same time, in the same era, on the same tracks I was racing on myself, week after week, season after season, year after year. That's exactly why these two names stick with me today, all these decades later, right alongside the others I've already mentioned, and the one I still have left to talk about. The last man on this list, who in some ways combined a little bit of everything I just described in these first two men, wrapped up together in one driver. The last man is Dale Earnhardt, and by the time I saw him coming up through the ranks, I was already older myself, already mostly done with stock cars by then, but I watched him plenty from the sidelines over those years, and I'll tell you plainly, that man drove like he already knew exactly where you were going to be before you did, before you'd even decided it yourself. They called him the Intimidator, and that nickname fit him better than any nickname I ever heard handed to a driver in this sport. Better even than the Silver Fox fit Pearson. Dale didn't ask for the racing line. He simply took it. And if your fender happened to be sitting there when he did, well, that was your problem to sort out afterward, not his, and he'd tell you as much himself if you complained about it in the garage. What made him so complete as a race car driver was that underneath all that aggression everybody talked about, underneath the black paint scheme and the reputation, was a driver who genuinely understood a race car better than most of the engineers standing around him did. He could feel a setup going wrong 3 laps before it actually did, before the crew chief on the radio even suspected there was a problem developing. Watching him finally win that Daytona 500 after all those years of coming up short, after all those near misses that everybody in the sport remembers to this day, told you everything about how badly that man wanted it, and how long he was genuinely willing to wait for it without ever once giving up on the idea. I remember talking to people in the garage after that win, grown men who'd been in this sport for decades, hardened men who didn't cry easy about much of anything, and there wasn't a dry eye among half of them, because they all understood exactly what that moment meant after everything that had come before it. What separated Dale from a lot of the hard chargers I raced against in my own career was that his aggression was never blind, not for one single lap. It looked reckless to people watching from the stands, sure, that black car filling up your mirrors, but underneath it, there was real calculation happening, real feel for the racetrack that most men never develop no matter how many years they spend behind a wheel. He knew precisely how far he could push a corner before the car let go on him, and he pushed right up to that exact line every single time, lap after lap, without ever quite crossing it unless the situation truly called for it. That's a rare thing in this sport, rarer than people realize watching from a distance. Plenty of drivers have the nerve to push hard. Fewer of them have the actual feel underneath that nerve to know exactly where the real edge is sitting on any given lap, on any given racetrack, in any given set of conditions that particular Sunday afternoon happened to throw at them, whether it was a slick track or a hot one, or one chewed up bad by 300 laps of hard racing already. Looking back on it now, from where I sit today at 91 years old, I understand something about this sport that took me the better part of a lifetime to really settle on properly. People remember trophies sitting up on a shelf somewhere. They remember the number on the door and the paint scheme a man carried through his whole career. What I remember, sitting here now, is the competition itself, the men who made me better because they refused to make it easy on me. Not for one single lap of one single race. Richard taught me that patience outlasts recklessness over the long haul of a career. Cale taught me that fearlessness alone can carry a man a long way if he's willing to commit to it fully. David taught me that patience and cunning together beat brute speed every single time, given enough laps to prove it out. Bobby taught me that will, real will, can be sharpened into a weapon every bit as dangerous as raw talent. And Dale taught me what it looks like when raw instinct and hard-earned knowledge finally meet in the very same driver, in the very same car, on the very same Sunday afternoon. Every one of those men made me respect this sport more than I already did, and I already respected it plenty before I ever raced a single lap against any of them. I'm grateful, genuinely grateful, that I got to race against every single one of them during my career, in whatever cars I happened to be driving at the time. A man only finds out what he's really made of when somebody that good is running right beside him, lap after lap, refusing to let up, refusing to give him an inch of room he hasn't earned fair and square. That's true in stock cars, it was true at Indy, and it's true in life outside of racing too, if you ask me. Though I never was much of a philosopher, just a man who drove race cars for a living and happened to pay close attention to who was doing it better than me. These 5 men, in their own different ways, made me into a better competitor than I would have ever become racing against lesser men, and that's a debt I don't think I could ever properly repay them for. Not even after all these years of trying to say it plainly, straight out, the way I'm saying it to you right now, sitting here at 91, still thinking about every one of them.